Security Council needs to be challenged and led, well, as it were, challenged by the Secretariat and a very strong Secretary General. If I was asked one single reform, I was limited to one single reform, God help us, because there are many more necessary, but in the UN system, I would say it was the appointment of the Secretary General. This is a crucial job, and the way it's done behind closed doors, political trade-offs, manoeuvrings. Let me tell you an anecdote about the appointment of the Secretary General, which is, I think, very powerful. When I was director of Oxfam, we had a group of humanitarian agencies that used to meet a couple of times a year in Geneva. It was a particularly effective group because it wasn't formal or institutionalized. It was the directors of these agencies meeting and having an honest talk together about what we were dealing with and so on, and what confronted us. And we were coming up to the appointment of a new Secretary General. Now, once a year when we were meeting, we would have a lunch, a working lunch, in a very simple restaurant, with what were called the humanitarian ambassadors in Geneva. Those are the ambassadors who in the UN system, economic and social, and indeed disarmament, were based in Geneva as distinct from New York. We had a meeting with them, and we agreed that at this particular meeting we put the question to them, and the lot fell on me to put the question. And I looked at them all smiles and innocence and said, it was gentlemen, I'm afraid, gentlemen, could you please tell us, because we're so concerned, because it has so much significance for our work, what are the criteria upon which you've agreed for the selection of the next Secretary General? And they went around the table, and it was a sort of Gilbertian situation. It was the takeoff of diplomacy. They were all totally avoiding answering the question that went around until it came to the French ambassador, who was sort of convening them on this occasion, who was sitting immediately opposite me, and I gave him 200% marks for French candour. He looked at me straight in the eye and he said, Frank Judd, you know perfectly well the one criterion on which we are agreed. On no account should we have a strong Secretary General. And I'm afraid, I mean, we laugh, but I'm afraid that there has been an underlying agenda, quite widely spread in the UN, that we don't really want a strong Secretary General. We want a Secretary General who can do our bidding. Now, I think, considering that, it's quite extraordinary how one Secretary General after another, having been appointed, began to try and assert some influence. The present Secretary General is no exception. But we should, for that post, we should be looking for the best qualified person in the world. And there should be very clear criteria as to what it is that's needed. And of course, what's needed is somebody who will challenge the international community into seeing things from an international perspective. So it's
I think Frank has said what Brian Urquhart has said also very well. The governments prefer a secretary to a general. But I did quote the final document from Erskine Childers in the last speech. The formal title was "The World in Search of Leadership and the Need for." A world in need of leadership, tomorrow's UN, which sets out quite precisely how the job of the Secretary General could be defined and how candidates could be considered for the post and so forth. And not only the Secretary General, but other senior positions. It's very good for those who want to read a bit more. I must make 2 or 3 other points. First, of course, the Security Council has changed. Remember, in the 1960s, it was increased from 9 to 15 members at the present. I think people need to remember also that Kofi Annan, who perhaps was appointed as likely to be weak, was, in the view of a number of us, second only, if second, to Dag Hammarskjöld as being a remarkable, bold and leading Secretary General. And he did set up a group to work precisely on the reform of the Secretary of the Security Council. His report is called A More Secure World. I think it was 2004 or 5. It produced 2 proposals for having 25 members of the Security Council, or was it 24? 2 variations. Well worth, for those of you who are seriously interested, well worth looking at. It's on one of the UN websites. You can get it downloaded. And you can see that it was very skillfully balanced. It dealt with the question of permanent members. Should there be additional permanent members? Could one persuade some of the existing permanent members to give up their permanent seats? Very difficult, but that wasn't, I think, ultimately why Kofi Annan's proposals weren't accepted. It was they could not get Brazil in particular, India, Japan, and Germany. They could not get support for the General Assembly to agree on a pattern that could be adopted. And in that sense, having been 20 years as a UN staff member, I think we need to remember that it's easy enough to say, oh, it ought to happen like this. It's not through Kofi Annan not putting forward proposals. It's that the 192 governments couldn't agree. So that is a very real issue. Quickly on the other things, human security, I think, is an idea whose time has come and has a lot of support in the UN. I would love it, Frank, if the British review of its own security system was to take account of a broader concept of human security. Doesn't mean that the military side shouldn't be there, but it does mean, what about SARS, what about earthquake threats, what about other threats? Are we ready and able to cope with those from the point of view of the British? And as this is a British, but within a global system, Latvia of all countries and a number of others has done a survey of people, proper statistical survey. What makes you feel insecure? It's losing your job, falling sick, and not having a health system that can cope, etc. 20th on the list for the Latvians was there might be a nuclear conflagration. But it's quite possible to ask people and do a proper survey. Mori Ipsos could do it. Finally, Mr. Fazid, you said, is it dangerous for NGOs to plug the gap? Again, we could talk for great length. Personally, I think the NGOs haven't plugged the gap. They've made an important partial contribution, nowhere near plugging the gap. But I think why I would say it's been, on the whole, good, rather than letting governments off the hook, is that it has often pioneered ways that, one, have shown people what ought to be more generally, and two, often shown aid donors, or indeed other parts of the UN, what the UN can do. Often the NGOs have been pioneers for progress.